Hello everyone, I'm Katya Kartolashvili. I hope you can hear me well. I'm Head of Business Solutions Sales at Faziri. This is a telecommunication and security system integrator company based in Tbilisi, Georgia, already on the market for 28 years. We are a solution partner of Documents 360, which is a knowledge-based product, and I'm the co-organizer of this session, and we are glad to have you all. The topic of the day is data-driven approach to documentation. The speaker with me is Dr. Selvaraj Murugesan, Selva, the head of data sciences at Covico, the SaaS company. He has a master's engineering degree and PhD in computational mathematics from La Trobe University, and great interest in the documentation, technical writing, and data analytics. Um, just for your information, the presentation will be followed by a conversational session between me and Selva, and then we will have a Q&A session. You can see in the top right corner a button with a question mark. You can push that button and write your questions in the chat, and our moderators will collect all the questions and hand over it to Selva. So now I will pass on to Selva to start the presentation. In the end, we will have a small demo also. So thank you and enjoy.
Thank you, Tatya. Let me share my presentation. So, yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us from the lovely Georgia, and then I will kick off. So the presentation for today is more on data-driven approach to documentation. So, so the overview of this presentation is going to be, we'll be talking something about documentation development lifecycle, DDLC, and then we'll talk about what are the business outcomes we are trying to achieve using documentation, okay? And then we'll go into depth on how do we use data to make decisions in the realm of documentation. So those are the high level topics that we're going to cover in this webinar. So let's kick off. So this is not something new to anyone who's actually into technical writing. This is the typical documentation development lifecycle (DDLC), where you kick off with a planning process on what kind of documentation you need to do. So this involves talking to the stakeholders. There's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of stakeholder engagement happening in this first phase. That's the planning phase. Then the creation phase, where based on the input that you gathered, you create new knowledge. You create some taxonomy, and then you also trying to categorize what kind of topics you need to write, and then you create subsequent articles underneath those topics that you identified. Then you enhance based on the workflow. You peer review your content with fellow team members, and also get it peer reviewed by your subject matter experts just for quality control. Then you go into the organization mode, where you're trying to organize your whole knowledge into different taxonomy, and then also work on the hierarchy, the sequencing of those new knowledge articles and then topics. Then you try to manage them over a period of time. You probably know that most of the knowledge base articles, they go stale, they go out of date, so you have to constantly enrich and manage them at scale. And then you share. That's where the knowledge dissemination coming in. Creating a knowledge is fantastic, but you have to disseminate that knowledge across the wide range of audience. And then you also archive once it reaches its end of its life cycle. And sometimes you also destroy the documents based on your compliance or regulatory requirements. And then again, the whole process kicks off with new planning when you're trying to refresh your knowledge base. So this is the typical kind of the documentation life cycle journey that most of you would experience, irrespective of what kind of domain you are in, whether you're in a SaaS product company, or probably in your manufacturing or textile industry, or any kind of process industry, or any kind of service industry as such. Okay, so this is the typical kind of the knowledge creation process. And let's talk about the interesting topic called knowledge repository. Uh, so the main aim to create a knowledge repository is for if you're working in a software domain. Basically, it's for any kind of product documentation. If you're in a software industry, this involves software documentation. If you're in a hardware industry, probably it applies to creating manuals for a health device or a machinery or any kind of parts of a machinery and things like that. So a product document is a very whole, a big umbrella term, and some of the your standard operating procedures, user manual, your other kind of documents that lie in your corporate environment, you have to host them in some kind of a knowledge repository. So it's very essential. So essentially, the documentation lifestyle actually implies that you need to have a good knowledge repository in your organization. And sometimes this knowledge repository will be external facing. So you will be opening up your user manual, troubleshooting guide, or your product documentation to the external world, or sometimes internal facing for your own employees. The typical scenarios you can actually think of is if you have a lot of policy documents or any kind of projects or program documents. So usually put them into an internal knowledge base that's internal facing. It's never been open to any customers of your, even to the public. Okay, it's very important. There are two use cases emerging depending upon the access control you give. If it's an external facing knowledge repository, this is usually you do for customer satisfaction and retention purposes. To give a typical example, let's say you are a SaaS product and you want to make sure your SaaS product is usable by a wide range of audience across the globe. Of course, you need how to procedure documents and stuff like that. So that's the typical knowledge repository you need. In this domain, we call them as knowledge base. The other aspect in terms of knowledge base is in terms of internal facing, where we most of the organization use it for innovation and business continuity. So when you share knowledge amongst your colleagues across multiple departments, then it sets the stage for innovation. People can actually cross use some of the ideas you have or some of the things you actually developed into their product or services they do, and they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So basically, that's where exactly the core innovation and knowledge sharing happens. And the other important use cases you can actually think for an internal facing is business continuity. If if none of your internal employees tribal or corporate knowledge is actually documented, when they leave your organization, they take away the knowledge with them. So it's extremely important that you retain the knowledge of that employee in a knowledge repository, so that there is some kind of a business continuity happens for the organization. So these are the typical kind of scenarios for a knowledge repository. So what is data-driven documentation? So we are in this webinar, we are going to talk about it, and it's actually an approach to documentation to make data-driven decisions. So as a documentarian or a knowledge manager or a technical writer, I want to make rational decisions based on data rather than my gut feeling. Okay, so that's the approach we're going to talk about. And what it's trying to do is it's bringing science into validating some of the hypotheses we have. We no longer have to make any hasty decisions or gut feeling decisions. We can actually use data to make rational, logical decisions. So that's the essential idea. And the data also helps in understanding all the components of your documentation development lifecycle at a very granular level. So anything you do in terms of planning, creation, organizing, all the data relating to that particular element or the component of DDLC lifecycle can be captured and can be utilized for bringing efficiency and effectiveness. And most importantly, as a documentarian or the internal knowledge manager, you might be more interested in terms of how do I optimize my internal business process so that I actually justify some of the business outcome the documentation team is actually producing. The reason for that is most of the organization, they actually invest a lot of resources and budget in terms of people and tools for knowledge management as a whole. So they will hire a lot of business analysts or technical documentation writer or content writers, and then excuse me, and they also buy tools. A lot of tech stack is out there like SharePoint, and we also have Document 360, and they invest a lot of things on creating this knowledge repository. But how do we justify that business outcome to a C-level executive? It's always been a hard. That's exactly where the data comes into play. The once you have take a data-driven approach towards documentation, it helps you to quantify the value of documentation in terms of driving business outcomes. Now we'll go into a nice little framework in subsequent slides. So let's look at what's the purpose of data collection. Yes, as a technical writer, we are always fascinated about writing words. Yeah, we are linguistics, having passion for the technology, but we are not very focused on numbers. For us, the word speaks louder than numbers. But having said that, the numbers are the ones which actually justify some of the business outcomes you produce. Okay, you can't go and say to your C-level executives, because of the documentation, the customer retention is better, and then they'll ask you, show me the evidence. Okay, for evidence you need data. Okay, and that's exactly comes to the point of what is the purpose of data collection. You can actually picture this into two. The first one is we talk about measuring effectiveness. When I say effectiveness, these are business outcomes which are customer facing. So any kind of documentation that you build, if that documentation is external facing, when I say external facing, some of the customers of yours or partners, business partners or distributors of yours actually use that documentation, you need to quantify that business outcome, and you have to measure that. That's the effectiveness. And there's something about efficiency. Efficiency is a lot more inward focusing on the teams that you manage, or the technical writers who actually build the documentation. So you have to collect data to measure the efficiency, how quickly they ship or publish an article, how quickly they listen to a feedback and then modify an existing knowledge article. So it's all very important. And the other classical example in any kind of organization is, given that there's a lot of ISO standards that focus on quality, regulatory, and compliance. So it's extremely important for you to collect data to quantify some of the internal things that we do inside the organization. And comes the last point where when you go to a lot of meet a lot of customers hours, you obviously ask, how do I quantify the documentation? I am a technical writer and everybody's spending money and resources on me. How do I justify in what I do that actually helps drives the business outcomes? Okay, so it's extremely important you collect the data to quantify some of the business outcomes. Let's dive into before. Okay, so now you understood why the data collection is very important in terms of applying this approach, data-driven documentation. Let's look at what kind of types of data you can actually collect. So there are only two types of data you can actually collect when it comes to documentation. First is all this quantitative data that you can actually quantify. These are usually numbers. Some of the high-level metrics you can actually think of is number of articles somebody published, likes, dislikes, read time, what's the bounce rate, how much time they actually spend before they bounce off, and some of the workflow metrics you actually think of in terms of your review process, your technical peer review process. And so it's not there. It's not just that quantitative data. You can also think about qualitative data in terms of your organization might be sending a lot of surveys to your customers or internal stakeholders. So that's one. We can actually collect the feedback. And the other qualitative data we can actually have is in terms of the engagement journey, how your internal stakeholders or external stakeholders are actually navigating your knowledge repository, what kind of steps or the sequence they actually take, and where do they end up. Okay, so this is extremely important to get that qualitative data, to get the understanding the engagement and quantify, and then optimizing that customer journey. So here are the common questions that you usually end up when you do when you take this data-driven approach to documentation. So if you are actually doing an external facing documentation, these are some of the common questions you will be asked. Why is the customer support tickets going up? It's a typical use case, and the C-level executive might be concerned. The reason is that is a very important metric for a business executive or as an organization as a whole. That actually shows how much customer obsessive you are, and more importantly, how much do you care about your customers. Okay, and definitely you want to keep the customer support tickets number in a very manageable way, or maybe in the lower numbers. The reason is you can't justify the quality of your product. Okay, if the numbers are high, obviously you can actually expect a lot of churn. Okay, and the second typical problem is if you are operating some kind of a product or a service where you have a call center, obviously people are actually calling your support agents day in and day out, and then your call centers will be flooded with calls for simple things that they can actually use a knowledge repository and self-serve. Okay, it's an important metric for a business executive. Again, it focuses on absolute on customer satisfaction. And then the alarming question that most of the senior executives worry about is, why is the customer churning at this increasing rate? Okay, and the other aspect is in terms of product engagement. Why is my product engagement low? Okay, that also throws a limelight of whether you have sufficient if you have a complex software product or a desktop product, is my documentation good enough for your your customers to actually configure the product and use the product. Okay, so those are the typical kind of a common business outcome questions that your C-level executives will always have. So that's for the external facing documentation. But if it's an internal facing, I don't think there's much pressure in terms of producing business outcomes, because it's more about internal satisfying the internal stakeholders. They have a different set of priorities. So one of the typical thing is, if you have a lot of policy documents lying around in an organization, and then they have some kind of ambiguous information, and then somebody's putting in a keyword to find out specific information, they might not know the single source of truth. So that is hard. It's extremely hard. And people get fed up with this information discovery. They spend so much time in terms of trying to find the right relevant information for their job to do. Okay, job to be done. So so those are the typical high level common questions you see. So how do we solve this? How do we go? How do we take this approach from the data driven aspect? So our advice is always start from the top. When I say always start from the top, you go and talk to all the executives who are in charge of your knowledge repository inside your organization or any external facing organization. So they might have some kind of a question, okay, for which they want to quantify and measure and monitor. So you always start from the top level executives, and then you ask them what's the business priority, what's the key business question that they want to address and then quantify. So this is a typical thing. Once you start from the top, then you know what is the effectiveness. So the effectiveness comes from your customers, and it drives the efficiency. Okay, do not stop collecting the data only on the internal process, and then there's no way you can actually connect with the outcomes you're trying to produce. So when you start from the effectiveness, then you're trying to tell the story inside your organization and for your own clarity purpose. So the effectiveness, it comes from the business outcomes. Some of the key business outcomes I can actually think of is, how do I increase my customer satisfaction? How do I decrease the customer ticket resolution time? Okay, and more importantly, for any kind of business, how do I increase the revenue? How do I keep my cost low? So that's the usual typical kind of effectiveness metrics usually people have. Of course, based on the organization, it also differs. Then that actually helps you to drive the efficiency. So then you start collecting data about what's the lead time to publish. when do I start planning for a documentation and all the way to sharing the documentation? What's the lead time? It's good to capture that, where to get stuck in the process. Okay. And then the customer feedback resolution time. Let's say you write up a knowledge base, knowledge article, and then there's a lot of errors and a lot of accuracy problems. And then if a customer reports it, how quickly you go and modify the article to fix the issues in the article. Okay. And then the third important thing is for our own, if you're a tech writer out there attending this webinar, the most important thing you'll be caring about is what is the content quality. Okay. You have a lot of measures around that. More importantly, the engagement measures you tend to focus. And this is the typical framework that we use inside Document 360 to justify the value of documentation. Okay, so it comes from the Kellogg's framework. Like you do some activities, it produces some outputs, and the outputs helps to achieve some outcomes, and the outcomes provide some long-term benefits. So you need to map any kind of activity for you in this framework. And what we have actually given you in the slide is the typical kind of a SaaS software documentation. So if you look at the activities, these are the activities a technical writer in the software industry would do. They go and publish articles, they edit the articles, they also do a lot of SEO. Okay, so those are typical kind of things. Of course, part of the SEO, they will add alt text, accessibility, and those kind of things. So in terms of outputs, they do they produce volume of articles, they listen to the feedback and stuff like that. And in terms of the outcomes, they're trying to reduce the support ticket. Okay, they're trying to increase the support agent productivity in terms of finding the right articles in a short span of time. Of course, if you do a lot of the SEO activity, that's going to increase your brand visibility. Okay, the long-term benefit for your organization is your customer satisfaction goes up, you're able to retain the customer, the customer churn goes down, and you increase the product revenue. It's very simple, elegant kind of a framework to map any kind of internal activity you do to the business outcome. So, but when you start from the right hand side of this framework, and you work towards the left. So that's the usual kind of a process we do. So understanding those blocks, and then you go into the data collection mode. So that's the typical kind of a framework. So the approach we're going to take is you go and meet your C-level executive or business executive who is in charge for the documentation or the knowledge repository in your organization. It could be the CEO, or sometimes it could be the chief technology officer or chief operations officer. And then you define the outcome metrics in terms of key performance indicators like KPIs. And then once you have this KPI, you know what kind of data you're going to collect. Okay, and then you perform the data analysis with all the data that you collected, and then you produce the results, and then you go with the analyzing the results and then driving the change management. And guess what? This is not a linear process; it is an iterative process. It's always been an iterative, so you have to change a lot of these KPIs over time. So let's dive into a couple of use cases, and then I'll show you a bit of a live demo in terms of the product. The typical use case in any kind of SaaS environment, software documentation in particular, is reducing the customer support ticket. So that's the primary goal of any kind of organization, and then that justifies the investment into self-service knowledge base. Okay, the typical problem you have is you're getting a lot of support tickets. Support tickets is actually clogging your support personnel, be it a customer support ticket portal, or it could be the call centers. For example, if you have any problem with your mobile phone operator, what do? You just call someone with the customer care number, and then they are able to assist you. So if that number is going up, then it's a big problem. Okay. And also for the support agents who are out there at the end of the call center, who work in the call center, is they have to find the relevant information. Okay. And the other most pain point is you get repeated questions, repeated similar questions from the customers on how do I open this, and then or a lot of FAQs being repeated. And this is a very classical, typical kind of a business problem that most of the software product vendors or platform vendors they face. What is the solution? Yeah, of course, you got to build a knowledge base. It's a self-service software documentation you have to build. And let's look at what's the data you need to collect in terms of what you do internally and what's the business outcome you're trying to achieve. So the business outcome metrics are typically the volume of support tickets you received on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. How many of those support tickets are similar in nature, and what is the resolution time of each of those support tickets? So these are typically 3 business metrics you can actually look at. So those are the data points you need to collect, or some of the softwares or the tools that's out there will actually help you to get the number for you. And the most importantly, as a document or a technical writer, I'm more interested in terms of internal metrics. So the internal metrics is how much engagement happened on a particular knowledge base article. Okay, so to give you a story, let's say somebody calling about finding a troubleshooting guide, and you already written a troubleshooting guide. You want to correlate how many hits happen, what's the traffic on that particular knowledge base article, how many people actually read it, for how long, what's the average read time, and what's the bounce rate. Okay, so those are the typical kind of engagement metrics that you're only focusing on. And of course, if you have any kind of feedback enabled in your knowledge base article, you want to know likes and dislikes as well. Okay, that's the typical kind of a use case. Okay, let's go into a live demo, and then I'll show you what actually happened. So here is the knowledge base of Airtable. So you're probably aware of Airtable. It's very of an intuitive platform where you can actually manage a lot of work. It helps you to execute, it actually helps you to collaborate on a lot of projects and stuff like that. And here's a knowledge bit they have. They have this is built using Document 360, and this is the site. So if you type support.airtable.com, this is where you land. And for Airtable, I'm pretty sure they want to increase the self-service rate, because if somebody wants to configure any kind of automation, so so they have an article for all these things. So troubleshooting Airtable or automation, and they have all these kind of settings that they have, and how do you actually approach this problem. Okay, so instead of having a lot more support agents in the call centers and then the support agents, so they would rather have a self-service knowledge base. Okay, so that's what it is. But here's the thing that will be focusing on. So they will be using Document 360 to create this knowledge base. So let me go into the analytics page. So this, what I'm trying to show here is the portal in Document 360 where you actually create the knowledge, and what you actually see here is the knowledge base site, which is used by your content consumers, like your customers. Okay. All right. So the important metric that will be interesting is in terms of once you land here, you can actually see that the most of the highly read article is how do I embed YouTube Shorts? How do I center align the markdown? So these are the typical, and it's been read for 29 hours and 36 hours. So this is a very important metric for a technical writer. Okay, so this actually helps to quantify some of the things we do. Okay, that actually then you actually relate and create with the business outcome metrics in terms of reducing the support tickets. Okay, and then you also have a lot of article performance, how many articles have been published, and you can slice and dice with last month data and stuff like that. And here's the most important data you can actually think of in a more granular level, how many views, reads, like, dislikes, and stuff like that. So that actually gives you a little bit of a granular level, and also high level overview of where these your customers are actually coming from. Okay, so that gives away. And this is a demo site that I've actually set up for demonstrating this. So if you want any internal metrics for your technical writer, so you can actually go and see how many who's the admin, how many people they actually contributed, who are the top performance, how many articles have been published, and things like that. Okay, and the other important metrics is in terms of feedback. How many feedback have you received in last week? What are they? Or is it also dislikes and likes and stuff like that? Then you can actually have a data to make changes to your documentation. Okay, so the other aspect I always love is in terms of this quality control. It's not about how much you write, how much outcome you produce. The most important aspect is in terms of the ability to manage that the the quality control. Okay, so well, that comes usually in the workflow. So when you have kind of a workflow, and you can actually see where things are. Okay, so here is the workflow that I can actually show you, where these many articles are there, how many articles were being assigned to me, how many were overdue, and here it actually shows where things are. Okay, in the high level, and then you actually measure time as well. So that's a very important metric for a documentation team. So the second use case I want to demonstrate is in terms of innovation. Okay, everybody loves this keyword innovation, and what it actually means for it means different for different organization. But what we are actually focusing on here is how do I preserve the institutional memory for business continuity? How do I take all the tribal knowledge that's existing in my employee's head and then document it and then put it on a knowledge repository? So that's very important. The second aspect is, where does a single source of truth actually exist? Okay, it's extremely important. And the some of the internal documentation that you have in SharePoint and other tools can actually helps in terms of solving this business problem. Here, the metrics you are trying to optimize in terms of business metric is why it's taking so much time to find the information. Okay, how do I find the right information at the right time? Okay, so those are typical kind of the business outcomes a corporate governance team in your organization will be focusing on. These are like very internal focused. The internal metrics that as a technical writer you should be focusing on is more on terms of the what kind of keywords that your user actually putting into your knowledge base search engine, and how many of them actually result, how many of them they actually got the results for. Okay, and then the second one is in terms of workflow metrics, in terms of ensuring that you follow through a quality assurance process and then you produce a quality documentation. Okay, and then the third aspect is, if you have embedding links in your documentation and you click on it and it is a broken link, gives you a 404 error, not a great user experience. You want to find out, you want to hunt them and then fix those broken links. Extremely important. And the fourth aspect is in terms of engagement. What are the trending topics? What are the things I need to be focusing on? Let's dive into the. So right now I'm in document 360. I'm going into analytics. So now you can actually see something called search. So for this, so in last week we have about 1,000 searches, and then how many of them successful, how many of them not successful. The most important thing you need to find is the no results found. Here, these are the keywords that people are actually typing. For example, people are actually typing ask Eddie, pricing for document 360, WCAG, for which there is no article, there's no knowledge base article available in your knowledge base. What it actually helps you to do is it actually helps you to go and address the knowledge gaps in your documentation. Okay. The other aspect is your internal search volume and stuff like that. And then the most important thing is this link analytics. So if you look at links, so it actually tells you these many links are there and these many are broken. So there's about 13 links that are broken. So you need to fix those 13 broken links. Okay, and then how many of them are internally facing and then how many of them external facing. So it's extremely important to gather this data to enrich your user experience. Thank you, Tatia, and
Thank you, Sarava.